Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico 29, the Marquis de Rubi, and the Bourbon Reforms. We spent the past few episodes talking about the changes along the Spanish frontier and the people that neighbor the recently reconquered New Mexico. While I've talked about some of these reforms already as a result of those episodes, it's time to really take a look at the Spanish side of their responses to these changes. The Spanish did not take these changes just laying down. As we've talked about, in the early 1700s, the Spanish were unable to defend their frontier from different raids, and there were concerns about growing colonial powers on their borders, such as the French. This, combined with the Spanish's defeat in the 7 Years' War and declining revenues to the treasury, spurred change. The main drivers for these reforms were the energetic Bourbon kings of Spain, who saw declining revenues to the treasury. Throughout the Spanish Empire, reforms would be implemented to continue the flow of valuable goods back to the mother country. To describe the coming changes for New Mexico specifically, from Kiva, Cross, and Crown, quote, "If Fray Alonso de Posada had been resurrected in 18th century New Mexico, he would hardly recognize the place. Not that the Jornada del Muerto or the Sierra de Sandia looked any different. Not that the mainly agricultural, subsistence-level economy had changed, or the pattern of trade and hostilities with surrounding nomads, or the drought, disease, and isolation, but rather the colony's very reason for being. The Pueblo revolts and the reconquest by Diego de Vargas, set in the larger context of an increasingly secular world, had thrust up a watershed. The blood of martyrs flowed back to the age of spiritual conquests, the age of Fray Juan de Padilla and Fray Alonso de Benavides, while the tide of the future ran on towards the mundane, towards colonial rivalry, solicitation of sex in the confessional, and even constitutions. Defense had replaced evangelism." End quote. For New Mexico specifically, the goals of the Bourbon reforms could be best summed up as end the indigenous tribes from raiding, build and grow a sustainable economy, and better integrated into the trade networks of the empire. The Spanish wanted a self-sufficient buffer state between the wealth-producing northern mining settlements and the indigenous nations on the frontier. In August 1765, it was decided that a general inspection of the presidios was needed to help define what these reforms would be. In 1766, the Marquis de Rubi arrived in Mexico to begin the inspection. By July 14th, he had reached Quetzal, the southernmost outpost of New Mexico. One recommendation out of Rubi's report was to reduce the number of outposts to 15 and to place these along a line drawn from the Gulf of California to the mouth of the Guadalupe River, roughly following the 30th parallel. The exception to this was to be New Mexico, which would also have a new garrison in addition to the existing one. The Reglamento y Instrucciones para los Presidios of September 1772 was an outgrowth of this effort and reorganization of the frontier. The Apaches were one of the big barriers of the Spanish, especially once they were pushed south by the Comanches. One plan was for the establishment of frontier military districts and the establishment of the intendancy system. The plan was to begin establishing these intendancies in 1769, but it ended up delayed until 1786. And the reorganization of the military districts, however, was underway by 1776. As part of this reorganization, the Spanish would create the Commandant General to be an independent unit overseeing the northern frontier, which would be renamed the Provincias Internas, or internal provinces. This change also reduced the power of the viceroy. Many viceroys, as a result of this, would criticize the creation of this new jurisdiction, although the two units did have to work quite closely together. The Commandant General would report directly to the king, although he was supposed to keep the viceroy in the loop of what was going on so that aid could be sent quickly rather than waiting for the king to send a letter to the viceroy. In New Mexico, they also would split off the Comandante de Armas from the governor to take over the military duties the governor formerly had. For the most part, the goal was to leave the civil administration to local officials that could then focus on the civil administration side and create another group to focus on the military side of governing a province. The Commandant General was also in charge of several treasuries. Sonora was to establish a mint. There was also the establishment of the Acordada, who were like a rural police force. Arzepe, Sonora was originally chosen as a base for the Commandant General, but it kind of moved around depending on where the need was and who was Commandant General. Later on, though, it would bounce mostly between Chihuahua and Durango. On May 16th, 1776, Teodoro de Croix was appointed the first Commandant General. Croix's jurisdiction was Coahuila, Texas, Sonora, Sinaloa, Nueva Vizcaya, New Mexico, and the Californias. Nuevo Santander and Nuevo Leon were added later in August of that year, though. Croix essentially held viceregal power over his domains. Military affairs were still his main priority, though. Croix was to systematize the forces and wage war on the frontier. At first, this reorganization was definitely an experiment. It was a series of stopgaps and not a panacea to the problems the Spanish were facing. And these stopgaps were pretty much to be abandoned as soon as they proved to be inefficient, ineffectual, or something better arose to be implemented. There wasn't a unified goal for these reforms. just a thought that reform was needed and trying out various ideas until something worked and sticking with that until it either stopped working or something else became better. Croix was mostly focusing on rearranging the presidios, a secondary line of settlements, protecting the horse herds from raiders, and introducing various reforms. From 1777 to 1778, he inspected his jurisdictions, and the reforms he did try to introduce did enjoy partial success, and overall he had very little friction with his subordinates. As we talked about, the line on the 30th parallel was the main goal that was trying to be carried out. They're also trying to reorganize the actual troops into something that was more of a fast response trooper, someone that could be quickly dispatched to deal with a raid or another issue without needing time to prepare and go on campaign. They're trying to adapt to the warfare they were encountering rather than a more European-pitched battle style of warfare. It's also during this time, as part of the internal provinces, that New Mexico would get its new focus. Defense would replace evangelism until the mid-1800s. New Mexico was to become a buffer region between the mining cities around Zacatecas, and first, the indigenous nations on the frontier, and later the United States. Both the Spanish and Mexican governments will embrace this idea of a buffer state between their income-producing holdings and the nations that surround them. The Mexican government would later try a similar experiment by bringing in American immigrants into Texas to try and form a buffer region, with the Americans being the first line of defense from the southern settlements. Again, the goal of these reforms overall was to smooth the machinery of empire that funneled funds from the colonies to Spain. Raids on Spanish settlements to the south would upset the flow of these mining goods to the treasuries. In 1778, Croix suggested breaking the internal provinces into two districts. Coahuila, Parras, Saltillo, Texas, Nuevo León, and Nuevo Santander were to be the eastern district. The rest, including New Mexico, would be the western district. In 1783, he would also become the Viceroy of Peru and obviously leave his role as Commandant General. Felipe de Neve was promoted to replace him, however he would die in August 1784. José Antonio Rangel would replace him, and around the same time, Jacobo Ugarte y Loyola, who had considerable frontier experience, would also be appointed to office. As we'll see, the Spanish were big fans of dividing and recombining the internal provinces again and again, with the Commandant General overseeing all of it, but different commanders below them with their own level of independent command. Kind of like what we talked about with the Apache War in the last episode, where different parts of the internal provinces had different goals or different policies with how they were dealing with this problem. Overall, this newest appointment would be followed by a skew of reformations that again showed that Spain wasn't really planning out their frontier policy with some unified vision. In 1785, Bernardo de Galvez succeeded to the post. He was the son of the viceroy, and he had a kind of a different plan for the frontier. His plan was a lot more based on what he had seen working well for French and English colonial dealings with the indigenous tribes, and more of like a piece by purchase style. And Juan Ugalde and Jose Rengel were to assist in overseeing the east and central districts, respectively. However, Galvez would die in 1786, less than a year after taking office. In March 1787, Viceroy Manuel Antonio Flores would be given complete command of the internal provinces. In December, he abolished the separate commands and consolidated them back into a northern and two independent districts. The Provincias Internas del Poniente included California, Sonora, Nueva Vizcaya, and New Mexico. Rangel was again made subordinate to the Commandant General after being briefly independent from it. The Provincias Internas del Oriente were under Juan Ugalde, who was also made the Commandant General. Ugalde was supposed to devote himself to the military. In March 1788, the authority over the Commandant General was removed from the Viceroy again and made again an independent unit. Around this time, the Commandant Inspector, which was another post the Spanish had created during this swath of reforms, would be wrapped into the Commandant General's authority as well. In 1790, Antonio Cordero was left in charge until Pedro de Nava was installed in March 1791. Ramon de Castro was put in charge of the Eastern District. Again, we talked about this specific change in the last episode. And in November 1792, the Provincias Internas were again reunited into one district. Nava to be in charge of the whole thing as Commandant General. The Californias, Nuevo León, and Nuevo Santander, however, were broken off of the internal provinces and given to the Viceroyalty instead. This change in what made up the internal provinces was mostly due to concerns of foreign invasion and needing something like the Viceroy who could levy a large response quickly. In 1786, the Ordinance of Intendants for New Spain was implemented to try and cut down on corruption, increase administrator loyalty, and increase administrative efficiency. It got rid of many civil officers and replaced them with 12 governor intendants. The intent was to standardize the government across New Spain, and most of the governor-intendants were provincial Spaniards and not local Criollo power holders. New Mexico might have been wrapped into the intendancy of Durango, but the poverty in New Mexico meant that the financial side, really the only thing the intendants had any power over, was essentially nothing. The governor-intendant did have a bit of power over certain legal matters, and it's entirely possible that New Mexico may not have been wrapped into the intendancy system at all due to the endemic raids on it, which demanded a military governor instead of a civil one. Overall, the intendancy system didn't really work. Since certain regions were excluded from the system, it failed to achieve its goal of actually standardizing Spanish rule in the New World, as well as other problems that arose throughout its time that really it was unable to adapt to. And overall, there was just too few heads working in the administration, and more people were needed to help run the wheels of government. The system would not be abolished, however, until 1824, after Mexican independence. Nava would be replaced by Nemesio Salcedo y Salcedo in August 1800. He would serve in this role until 1813, making him the longest-serving commandant general. In 1804, they split the Provincias Internas again, but the implementation of this was delayed until 1812. Bernardo Bonavia y Zapata, governor-intendant of Durango, was chosen to lead the western provinces, while Alejo Garcia Conde was then to fill the post that Zapata had just left. In the eastern part of the internal provinces, it went to Simón de Herrera until he was killed and replaced by Felix Calleja, but he declined to take the offer. So then it would go to Joaquín de Arredondo. He had no instructions or goals in his new office and was thus quite ineffective. Plus, exactly where he was responsible for and to whom he was responsible for the various parts of his office were confusing and contradictory. The western provincias internas were Sonora, Sinaloa, Nueva Vizcaya, and New Mexico. Durango was made the capital of the western provinces. In 1814, the viceroy ordered the capital be moved to Chihuahua. The reasons he included for this change was that the US of A had designs on New Mexico. In November 1817, Garcia Conde took over the whole thing, and he would remain in office until Mexican independence. In 1818, the Commandant General was reduced to just another frontier military official, though, and they would never really make it into the same level of influence it had before. No Commandant General would ever pay an official visit to New Mexico, but some of the Commandant Inspectors did. In addition to the Commandant General, about 35 encomenderos were still charged with the defense of New Mexico without pay, a carryover from the early colonial days. After the Pueblo Revolt, 2 presidios were also created in New Mexico, and while this helped with defense, it did not lead to lasting peace. These presidios never had enough men or weapons. In the 1720s, the Santa Fe Presidio only had 80 men. El Paso also only had 50 at the same time. Governors would often ask for more men, but these requests were denied. In the second half of the 1700s, more reforms did try to help with these manpower issues, but they never really solved the key issue, which was they could not have enough men, and even if they did not have enough weapons to arm these men. In the 1770s, El Paso's Presidio would be relocated to the south. This would leave only Santa Fe's Presidio in New Mexico proper. And while several more presidios would be proposed in the province, little would be done to actually create them. The soldiers in these presidios were often the sons of officers, and often became officers themselves. Spain would later also increase presidio strength to 120, but this did not, again, if you cannot recruit enough men, increasing the number of men you want to have recruited does not solve that problem. There were decent benefits and pensions for service as one of the presidio soldiers, and overall the backbone of defense for the province was the citizen soldier who enrolled in the service of the presidios. Sometimes auxiliaries would be pulled from the indigenous nations around New Mexico, either coming as volunteers or in campaigns against a traditional enemy. This would be like one of the pueblos volunteering to serve, or a group of Navajo joining the Spanish for a campaign against, say, the Gila Apaches. The duties of the presidio included guarding the horse herds, which were often positioned in the Galisteo Basin or Pecos River Valley, although sometimes pasture was around Pewaukee and Cuyamonga. For this, 30 men would be drafted for a set of days to guard the horses. They also had routine patrols throughout the province. For certain events like the yearly caravan or the Taos Trade Fair, soldiers would be stationed in the area. Overall, these reforms would bear fruit over time, though. Having continuous military attention, combined with the diplomatic pressure from other Bourbon reforms, did alleviate the raids. Raiding in New Mexico would peak in the 1770s, and due to things like the Comanche Peace, it would decline from that point forward. But though there would still be a low level of raiding and violence between New Mexicans and indigenous tribes until after the American conquest of New Mexico. And as we saw in the last episode about the Apache Revolt, it allowed the Spanish to be more responsive to the type of conflict found on the frontier and leverage the resources of the empire to actually wage effective campaigns to try and end the violence that they were seeing and to punish the raiders that weren't raiding them more effectively. It did take a long time to bear fruit, though. It was not an immediate, oh, we now have this military official and everything's fine and dandy. There was a lot of reforms that took of those people to get to lasting peace. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled ENGINEERINGFIRE.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.